Thank you, Les, and welcome to the conversation on big cats. I am so pleased that you will be here and sharing with us what you are doing. I think it's far simpler for you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your work and your experience, and then share with us your presentation before we go on to the discussion.
Okay, Latika, wonderful. I mean, for me, it's just such an honor to be sharing with you. One of the things with conservation is that we get to rub shoulders with remarkable people from all over the world. And for me, it's a real privilege to be here sharing my little story with you. So, I mean, from a personal point of view, I've been involved in conservation for 40 years, and I've been involved. My very first job was trying to teach 5 cheetahs how to hunt in the Timbavati Game Reserve of South Africa as a 19-year-old, fresh from the army. So, literally a background that is from 1980 right the way through to today, has been involved in engaging with conservation areas and predominantly setting up and establishing new conservation areas. And obviously, if you want to have the full blend of biodiversity, you've got to have the cats reintroduced as well. So they've always been a big part of my background and experience. So I'd like to just run through a little bit of that, and then the 10 years that I spent translocating wildlife full time was what set me up to be employed by andBeyond to build the first of the andBeyond models, which was at Phinda Private Nature Reserve. So I really had a remarkable journey for 10 years before jumping on the most remarkable part of my career, where I've been for the last 30 years, which has been with andBeyond. In those early days, it was obviously called the Conservation Corporation, and it became Conservation Corporation Africa. And it was designed around trying to mitigate the threats that conservation faced 30 years ago. And the 2 biggest threats that were identified to conservation were relevance in a local community context. And if you didn't have support from local communities, your conservation area would be flawed. And then the other one was funding for conservation. At that stage, 30 years ago, there was very little alternative to donor funding or state funding, both of which were considered to be fickle. So that's the background, and that was how I got to be where I am today. So I'd like to share some of those stories with you.
Wonderful, thank you.
I'm going to move on to the presentation now, if you don't mind. There we go. So I've just chatted through my background, and the fact that andBeyond was set up to leave the world in a better place is a fundamental part of what we're going to do. We'll talk about cheetahs, lions, and leopards, and how we can use this conservation system to leave the world in a better place. So the privilege of being able to work with these big cats from a very, very young age really gave me a different insight into the challenges that they face, and particularly, the blend of predators that occur in Africa. Cheetah certainly aren't at the top of the hierarchy of predators, and they get affected by everything that affects all the other predators, and they get affected by more things which the other predators are less susceptible to because of their position in the hierarchy. So being able to understand how that worked in the conservation world was really funny, and having driven in a motor car with a cheetah sitting in the seat next to me while it's going to a hospital to have its hip replaced, and stopping at a traffic light and looking out the window, and the pedestrian standing at the traffic light looking into the car, and suddenly their eyes get really big as they realize this is not a person sitting next to this man but a cheetah, and the shrieks of hysteria and laughter that accompany the sight of a big cat in the middle of urban areas was quite remarkable 40 years ago. For me, it's been interesting to see the big cat's interaction with cities and towns through the work that's been done more recently around Delhi, with the leopards walking around the outskirts of town. And they've been involved in our cities and our towns much longer than we've ever known. And it hasn't really been exposed, but it's coming to the fore now. But it still creates a wonderful response from people most of the time, and sometimes a very negative response. So the cats have been a big part of what I've done, but we were also involved in significant numbers of herbivore translocations because cats need food. And if you're going to reintroduce, the game reserve, you've got to reintroduce the prey base first. So I moved about 40,000 head of wildlife during the 10 years before I joined andBeyond. Everything from the smallest of the antelope, like Sunni antelope, through thousands of impala, which are the major prey base that we have, right up to giraffe and elephants and rhinos. And all of these species recreating biodiversity on land which we had in the South African context that had predominantly been used for cattle farming. So you had the natural base, you had normally depleted grasslands, but as soon as you kept the cattle out, the grasslands recovered. So it was easy to do these reintroductions into a reasonably established and reasonably stable system that could support the wildlife that you were reintroducing. So we were very privileged, and I have to say that as at the start, to be able to have that palette in which to work for the conservation development. So these 40 years of development then led to the establishment of andBeyond, and it was effectively set up to leave the world in a better place. And if you try and understand that any commercial organization, and if every commercial organization had an objective that was more than just profit driven, we would all be in a better place. So for me, it was a wonderful privilege to be part of something that was looking at caring for the land, caring for the wildlife, and most importantly, caring for the people. And using these world-class guest experiences as the heart of the machine that drives benefit into all three of the regions. So the care of the land system was actually securing the wildlife and then making sure that our environmental footprint was as small as possible. So taking as little as possible out of the environment. We all have an impact when we operate in any environment. You've got to recognize that you have an impact, but how do you reduce that negative impact on the environment? And then use the other side, the conservation and community development side, as the opportunity to give more. And if we can give more into the systems, and if we can help the communities more to reduce their impact on the environment, we can get to an equilibrium where our negative impact from the development is offset by hugely positive impacts on both the wildlife and the communities. And that's always been our model: create these world-class, life-changing experiences for guests and leave the world in a better place when the guests leave. For me, that's been one of the drivers that's got me out of bed every day. For the 10 years that I caught game, it was such a privilege to see giraffe walk out of the back of a giraffe truck onto a piece of land that hasn't had giraffe for 100 years. Or to see gaur run out of a truck in India in Bandhavgarh, where they'd been locally extinct. I mean, the thrill of seeing those animals returned in an Indian context was just remarkable. And then being in Argentina and sitting in the Ibera wetland and watching the reintroduction of jaguars taking place, where they're going to breed the jaguars in captivity pre-release. So being able to see this on 3 different continents has been a remarkable experience. And it shows that the future of conservation just needs to be adapted, and the model can work in any environment. It just needs to be adapted. The legs can get longer or shorter depending on the circumstances. So that's been the real driver for us. And understanding what andBeyond has achieved in the 3 pillars of its model is quite remarkable for me. Every time I read these statistics, I get blown away. 2,000 kilometers of coastline is impacted by our Oceans Without Borders initiative. We have about 9 million acres of wildlife real estate that we directly impact on with our tourism operation. But we also go into the negative impacts that I spoke about, and we produce 17 kilograms of CO2 per head across the group. So we measure our carbon footprint very clearly. And this obviously has implications down the line. 415 liters of water is the average water utilization per head. Over 100% of our lodges are audited every year by our internal environmental audit that looks at all 3 of these columns clearly. And that's where we get the measurements that I've just spoken about as well. We've instituted water bottling plants across all of our lodges, and that saved about 750,000 plastic bottles a year into the environment, just by implementing water bottling plants across all of our lodges. So quite remarkable from a care of the land point of view, the range of impacts. And these are just selected statistics. This isn't all we do. This is part of what we do on care of the land. On care of the wildlife, our Rhinos Without Borders project has released the net of over 100 rhinos into Botswana, and they continue to breed really well. The gaur reintroduction that we did into Bandhavgarh National Park has netted over 150 gaur now. And that's remarkable from an area where when I first started engaging in there, the negative sentiment about the potential of a project like this to work in India was overwhelming. People were really concerned that there's just too many vested interests to be able to make something like this work in India. And it really wasn't easy, but we were fortunate in that we had a very progressive forest department at the time, which supported that kind of activity. So conservation outcomes, wildlife conservation outcomes from a predominantly tourism-led wildlife organization like ours was also unique in that here we are as a advisor to the forest department on conservation issues, but we're a tourism-led conservation organization, which is in many people's minds it's a contradiction in terms. So we've had significant input in the oceans as well, with 10 grey reef sharks tagged through our Oceans Without Borders project, but most importantly in the wildlife side, the future of wildlife all over the world is going to be dependent on the relevance of wildlife to the people. And 18,000 conservation lessons being conducted across all of our reserves. 28,000 hectares of wildlife real estate converted from alternative agriculture and cattle farming to wildlife. And then one marine sanctuary established around Vamizi, which is in the Carimbas archipelago. So more than just the land successes that we've had, which are substantial, also starting to duplicate this through our Oceans Without Borders project in the oceans, which are just as important for our futures as the land management is. And then, of course, care of the people is our integration of all of the different activities that we do. If wildlife is not relevant to the people, it will have no future. And I think that's clear across the world. 75 communities that we deal with across Africa. We've 285 classrooms have been built because the communities are next door to wildlife areas. Then that in itself means that thousands of children walk into classrooms and are being educated every day because they live next door to a wildlife area. So making that wildlife area much more relevant to their own situations and improving their own situations. And then 11 centers for orphans and vulnerable children who don't have parents. Again, keeping the fact that the future of our wildlife has to be in the hands of the youth of today. And we can't leave out any segments of the youth of today if we're going to make sure that wildlife is going to be sustainable going into the future. So that's the model and what we've achieved in all three of the areas that we operate in. But let's have a look at some of the conservation learning. And I think this is where it really gets interesting, because for me, if we're doing all these things and not learning anything, then we're literally wasting our time. So I've made some significant mistakes in my life, and I think most of our mistakes on the foundation side, engaging the local communities, have been mistakes that I've made. And the reason why I've made them is because I'm too passionate and in too much of a hurry, and often leave behind the pace at which the communities can work. So one of the dangers of having passion and being driven, which we need to make conservation work, is that when you get into the communities, you have to check that very carefully, and you have to slow it down to the pace of the people that you're working with. Otherwise, it doesn't have any future. So some of the learnings that I've taken out of conservation is that the most important thing is that conservation is complicated. It's not a simple activity. It really isn't, and it's different in different places. And for me, it's really dangerous to oversimplify conservation with one-liners, because a certain action in one area can be a complete game changer, and in another environment, the same action can be a total disaster. So it's very, very important that people measure what they're doing in conservation carefully before they commit to it. We believe that we have to locally craft solutions for local problems. There's no broad stroke that's going to work everywhere. Locally crafted solutions for local problems is going to facilitate adapting to what the local nuances are that you need to include in this complicated conundrum of conservation. So, I mean, an example for us is that we're putting in huge effort through the Lion Recovery Fund, funding desnaring operations in the Serengeti to try and secure the Serengeti populations that are being hammered as a bycatch of meat poaching or snaring. And yet in our reserves in South Africa at Pinda, we're doing unilateral hysterectomies to try and slow down the population growth. So two completely different actions. for one species. In one area, we're trying to secure them and we need their numbers to increase. In another area, we need to slow down their growth because there's nowhere to move them to out of their production. There just aren't any, there isn't space for lion to move them to. So that, for me, it epitomizes what the conundrum is in conservation, which is that it's not simple and it needs to be very carefully considered. We look at the fencing situation again, which is a lovely debate. In some areas, fencing is absolutely essential for conservation, and in other areas, fencing is a complete disaster and it completely destroys the big picture conservation initiatives. So which one's right? Is fencing good or is it bad? Well, in some areas it's good and in other areas it's bad. So there's just no simple answer to these conundrums. And I think one of the biggest conservation threats that we face, which you and I are fully aware of, is the fact that conservationists just can't agree on anything. And one of the problems we have is that we take views which are challenged, and then we won't deal with the person that's challenged our views, regardless of what other conservation activities we might agree on. But because we've disagreed on one thing, we won't deal with each other anymore, and therefore you're the enemy, and I'm not going to talk to the enemy. So I think we're going to have to put our egos in our pockets coming out of COVID-19 into the new world of conservation, and we're going to have to accept many more things that we traditionally have not accepted as part of the conservation solution in the future. We're going to have to do everything in conservation better for conservation to sustain. And I think conservation to be sustainable is going to have to be more relevant to the communities and to the social fabric. Conservation cannot sustain unless its relevance in society is elevated. And that, I think, is going to be the key. I think Dr. Pabla, who's just written that book, The Road to Nowhere, describes it absolutely beautifully. And I think he says that while the environmental benefits of conservation are enjoyed by the entire society, the cost is borne only by the poorest people that inhabited the forest landscapes. And I think that Indian example applies all over the world. And I think for me, that's the challenge, is we have to find ways of keeping social relevance, not only to the rural people that inhabit the forests that bear the brunt of the wildlife-human interactions, but also all the people who live in the cities who are divorced from what's happening out in the field, and all the people who have the resources to make a difference to those environments, who are channeling their resources into all of the threats that the world is facing today. We've got to be more focused in the way we engage, that conservation is about our own futures on the planet, and it's about securing our planet and our futures rather than about something that is for the elite or something that is for the conservationists who are on the other side of the scale. We're industrialists. We don't want to talk to the conservationists because they stop us from doing it. That whole, we're going to have to break down all of those traditional views of what different forms of land use do for us to be able to take it into the next level. And I think we really can. And I think being at home and sitting thinking about all these things a lot more is going to hopefully open a whole lot more doors that weren't open before to conservation. We just have to locally craft them to make sure they fit in with the local nuances for them to be sustainable. So when we look at the learnings and we move into some of the things that I've been involved in through establishing a Big 5 game reserve at Pinda and using translocation as a tool for conservation. We've had 29 years of really big conservation firsts. First reserve to reintroduce cheetah and lion to the same reserve. First reserve to mix lions from different prides. The first reserve to introduce adult elephants, and the list goes on. But most importantly, it's understanding that when we wanted to reintroduce cheetah into Pinda, the Conservation Authority said to us, you can't. And we said, but why not? And they said, well, we've tried it. It doesn't work. So I said, well, what did you do? And they said, no, well, we released 10 cheetah a month into our parks. And the numbers were about 100 cheetah had been released into the parks, and they had 15 left in the parks. So they were really concerned that the environment wasn't conducive to supporting cheetah, because it's much thicker, as you can see from this photograph, quite bushy and quite encroached environment. And they were concerned that the environment wasn't ready for cheetah. So I said, well, you know, can we interrogate a little bit more your reintroduction plan and what program you used? So they said, no, we explained that, you know, we reintroduced 10 a month. So I said, but did you habituate them first? Did you teach them about local prey? Did you habituate them about fencing, because they'd never encountered fencing before? And they said, oh, no, we didn't try any of those things. So we said, well, that's what I'd like to try. And they said, well, that's cool. Let's try that. But there was no legislation for them to give me a permit to put cheetah on private land in northern KwaZulu-Natal. So conservation authorities first had to go and change the legislation. They gave me a zoo license to start the reintroductions while they changed the legislation behind the scenes to accommodate the creation of a Big Five game reserve on private land. So here was the private sector working with a very progressive conservation agency to adapt the local provincial legislation to accommodate what we were trying to do. And the net result was 15 cheetah reintroduced and a significant impact on cheetah reintroductions across all of Southern Africa. This was the cheetahs being collared, radio collared, just before they were released. We first held them in a predator boma, which had 2.5 meter high chain link fencing with electrification on it. We then moved them into this boma, which had a similar fence to the boundary fence, which was only 1.8 meters with 3 strands of electrification. And we made sure that they were contained by that electrification, which was similar to the boundary of the reserve. And once they were contained there, we released them. But we had telemetry on them so we could track them all the time in case they broke out and ended up in the community. You mustn't forget, we were developing this reserve right on the boundary of 22,000 people who live next door to us. The highest density of rural people in northern KwaZulu-Natal were next to where we were developing one of the bigger Big Five game reserves of the time. So the end result was unbelievably good cheetah viewing at Phinda, and it remains one of the best places to go and see cheetah in the world today. So progressive conservationists who adapted the regulations to accommodate what was a good conservation initiative, and it's ended up with over 150 cheetah cubs being born to that population, and we've translocated and re-established more cheetah populations. We've moved about 70 odd cheetah off Phinda in the last 15 to 20 years. So again, a significant impact on cheetah populations in the country as a whole. And that traditional sort of dispersal of cats was done mechanically in this particular case. So the one thing we had the technology to do was mechanical dispersal to help establish new core populations. And that was one of the challenges that I think most conservation areas face around the world, is as we develop, as populations grow, all the traditional migratory and dispersal routes get cut off. How do we get through those high densities of people to the next conservation areas? And the way we've done it, and the lesson that's worked for us, has been mechanical dispersal, catching the animals at dispersal age and translocating them to a new area, releasing them there so they don't have that perilous journey to get to where they need to be. We just hop them across. And that's been really successful for us in the Phinda context, and certainly in the cheetah context. So if we look at that in the lion context, my first lion came into the Phinda private game reserve in May 1991. And again, I didn't have a permit for lions. So the conservation authorities, we told them lion tracks, we've got lions, we'd already applied for a permit, they're busy changing the legislation. But this male lion was just too early. So unfortunately, we couldn't keep him. We had to remove him from the property. He'd also killed an extensive amount of cattle before he got to us. He'd moved through high density cattle farming areas before he arrived at Phinda Private Game Reserve. But within 3 or 4 months of him being there, we got our permits and we were able to start our reintroduction of lions onto Phinda. And our first 5 sub-adult lions came from the Sabi Sands Game Reserve, very well-known South African private sector game reserve. But they were all sub-adults and they had no adults. So we couldn't really release them as a pride. They were still quite young, sort of 18 months old. So we brought in 2 unrelated lionesses from 2 different areas, and we used sedation to put the lionesses with the sub-adult lions. And together they formed a pride pre-release, and the sedation lasted about 14 days. So they would be feeding in a sedated state next to other lions and getting to know each other and getting the smells of each other and not killing each other, which they normally do in that confined space. So this was remarkably successful for us. It doesn't always work in that they don't always stay together, but these 2 lionesses stayed together post-release, and the 5 sub-adults stayed together, and that gave us confidence to try it again. So every lion reintroduction that we did, we used different lions from different prides, and we had some success with that technology. It wasn't possible before. At least the lions didn't kill each other, and you were able to reintroduce them into the same reserve. So that was a massive step for us from a conservation perspective. Understanding those density of communities as well, and the potential for lions to cross fences, we microchipped every lion. And then we went to the communities and said, we've microchipped the lions, and they said, yeah, but we don't have microchip readers. So if the lions come and kill our cattle and we kill your lion, how do we know it's your lion? Because the conservation authorities traditionally say it's not their lion. You say it's not your lion, so then nobody's responsible, so we don't get our compensation for the loss. Because I'd always said to the communities, if we introduce animals, we'll compensate you for their loss, which we'd agreed in writing. So we had to find a way of marking these lions that was acceptable to the communities, but wasn't going to impact on tourism. The first thing we had to do from a scientific point of view was put radio telemetry on them. And then we didn't want to brand them, so we used a really innovative opportunity, and we tattooed a P on the gum of the lion just above the canine. And this was remarkably successful. The communities were delighted that they could identify the lions. If they shot it, they could just lift the lips and see if it's got the pinned P. What we didn't realize is that animals' gums grow. So the P became a D, and then it became a C, and then it disappeared completely. But by then the relationship with the communities was so good, and the lions had already been in for 3 years, that it wasn't relevant. So we tried these new techniques all the time with some of our reintroductions. The end result was a collared lion. You can't see the P in its gum, and it's got no other marks on it. So it worked really well from a lion reintroduction perspective. So some really nice early learnings for us in the lion reintroduction situation, and most importantly, understanding the hierarchy of predators. There had been no successful reintroduction of cheetah onto established lion populations, and to this day I don't think anybody's been able to achieve that. So the lessons are that if you're going to reintroduce cheetahs, make sure you get them established first, make sure that they're breeding and they know the lie of the land before the other predators arrive, which gives them a leg up because of their hierarchy. That enables them to sustain into that predator high situation. The lion population grew really well, and it wasn't long, and we were looking at dispersal of these lions. So we used aerial dispersal to move the lions. We filled the aircraft with lions and flew them 1,300 kilometers across Africa and released them in the deserts of Swalu. So these lions had come out of high density vegetation, high prey areas of KwaZulu-Natal, and we'd moved them to the semi-desert areas of Tswalu in the Kalahari Desert. So we had to hold them for another 3 months on that side and teach them about the prey that they would be encountering there, and give them a chance to acclimatize to the habitat that they were in, which was completely different. It was very successful. The Tswalu management decided that they wanted to rather go for Namibian genes. So they actually removed all the Pindar lions and then brought in Namibian genes afterwards. But our lions did really well for the 2 or 3 years that they were released in the Serengeti. So again, that lesson of dispersal 1,300 kilometers across the country is possible without any threat to the lion if you do it mechanically, if you mobilize and you translocate them physically. So you reduce the threat that the lions would have of encountering people all the way along their journey to get to the new destination. We also did this internationally. When African parks needed lions up in Rwanda, Pindar was able to donate lions out of this now really successful breeding population and fly them all the way up to Rwanda to establish a new lion population in Akagera National Park. So translocating internally and internal dispersal, but also international dispersal is possible using the mechanics and the technology that we have. So the tools for conservation are growing every day, and we've got a really full toolbox. What we really need is the ability to use that toolbox, and which tools will be applied in which environments needs to be refined. And the attitude towards the tools needs to be accommodated. In many areas, it's unacceptable to be playing with animals and to be removing some out of a population But we certainly don't have the privilege of just allowing these populations to carry on their own, because they certainly won't sustain, certainly not in our context. So really interesting opportunities for me that have been developed in the last 3 years to apply our lessons in new translocations, with the reintroduction of the jaguars in the Pantanal, or into the Ibera wetland, and the habituation of jaguars and the jaguar viewing that's happened in the Pantanal, all lessons that have been learned from the way predators have been managed in Africa. We did the same with leopards, of course. In our situation with leopards, we had a problem with the conservation authorities. They kept issuing permits to our neighbor to hunt leopards. And we were habituating the leopards, and then they would be hunted. And then we went to the conservation authorities and said, please, man, we've spent years habituating this Tom, and now he's been shot by our neighbor. Can't we withdraw the permit? So the conservation authority said, bring us the science that says what's happening is unsustainable, and we'll listen. But if there's no science, we can't change the regulation. So we embarked on a leopard research project with Panthera that lasted 10 years and changed the legislation on leopard hunting in the country. And what was remarkable is that the first 9 months of that leopard research, 415 kill records were made, and that leopard research went on to be phenomenal. 72 different leopards collared in a 10-year period, producing a massive data set, the biggest at the time on any leopard population. And it's literally changed the legislation on leopard management in all of the southern African countries. And I think Kenya and Tanzania have taken note of the fringe effect, which we picked up through the research, of unsustainable hunting practices on these leopard populations. So really interesting outcomes out of a tourism-led conservation organization influencing the way international legislation is happening on conservation. And what a pleasure. That's the kind of interaction that we need, where it's not just the traditional scientists that are providing the information, but it's using different vehicles, pulling them together to achieve that conservation outcome. That's the challenge that we need to work through. This was the image of one of the workshops that were held as part of the jaguar reintroduction in the Ibera wetland in Argentina. This was facilitated by Tompkins Conservation and the TLC, and they funded my trip over, and we spoke to the veterinary faculty in the local city in Corrientes, and then we spoke to all these jaguar specialists from all of South America. There were Argentinians, there were Brazilians, there were Chilean specialists, all working together on how best to do this reintroduction in Argentina. The net result was these jaguars that were held together in a confinement had cubs, and those cubs are now 2 years old and ready for reintroduction into the wild. And that's the ultimate of any of these projects, is rewilding these areas, as Tompkins Conservation call it, is taking traditional cattle farming and ranch land and rewilding it and getting these jaguars back. So massive impact on conservation from Tompkins Conservation in South America. They must be by far the biggest NGO on land donated to conservation or land influenced to conservation in the world. And what a privilege and a pleasure to have been invited to go and help them with a project as exciting as this. So, I mentioned earlier, and I've spoken about it before, but seeing these remarkable animals in India in the forests of Kanha and not seeing them in Bandhavgarh where they had them on the wildlife list, we had to do something about that. So building the capacity within the forest department to translocate gaur meant that the end result of the gaur translocation was a significant number of other species also translocated by the forest department. So reversing local extinctions became a tool in the toolbox of conservation, and it became much more mainstream than just the exception. And I think that's one of the exciting things about, we've fragmented wildlife all over the world. Population development has meant that conservation areas are in small patches all over. So all the traditional migratory routes and dispersal zones are all threatened. But we now have the technology to fix all of that and move the animals mechanically into these reserves, recreate the prey base, return the predators, and then reinstate wildlife as a relevant activity for the communities, driven by whatever industries we can out of wildlife, in our case predominantly tourism. So it's a really exciting model that we've been able to do, but not doing it alone. We have to do it in partnership with universities. We're part of the Lionscape Coalition, where the top ecotourism organizations in Africa, who all have lions on their properties, have joined forces with the Lion Recovery Fund to fund research and conservation activities in countries where we don't even have a presence, but where these small lion populations are being protected, making sure that the commercially viable lion populations of the Serengeti and the Mara and the Kruger National Park are funding the lions in the Central African Republic and in the Sudan and in the Gambia and all these West African and Central African countries. Looking at partnerships with traditional NGOs like WWF on rhino range expansion programs, working with traditional competitors in the tourism industry in Rhinos Without Borders. We don't have to be competitors in tourism. You building 10 new lodges, brilliant, go for it. Let's look at how we can work together, what we can do to help with your 10 lodges, because we've got 29 in other parts of Africa, and our guests might want to know about your guests, and your guests might want to know about ours. So together we have a much better chance of making a difference than if we stand on our own. And together we have a better future. There's been an Ubuntu comment that it came out of Desmond Tutu in the early days of resolving the South African conflict. And that's the future of conservation. We're reintroducing pangolins on Phinda with the Pangolin Working Group. We do all our community development with the Africa Foundation, making these wildlife areas completely relevant to the communities that live outside them. And then we've applied our terrestrial successes to the marine environment through Oceans Without and capacity building and protecting endangered species in the sea. And all of that involves the youth. If we don't educate the youth about the future of these conservation areas, and in our case, when you've got 10 lodges, you're going to be able to exceed this number of 18,000 students through your lodges, looking at the wildlife that they would otherwise have no access to. So we have the ability to just broaden these people's minds on the value of conservation around the parks and provide them with education and make a real difference to the environments that we choose to operate in. So from me, Latika, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share what we've done with you.
Oh, that's amazing, Les. I mean, thank you so much. It just brings so many years of experience to people who may or may not ever have a chance to visit one of your lodges. I was in Botswana at 3 of your lodges recently, and it was just, it was phenomenal. It was just so amazing. So I just want to go back to your experience in India. When you were in India and you were partnering with the Taj and had this series of lodges here, then you came in and you talked to the government. How did you break that initial, barrier that exists in government minds about working with people in the tourism sector? Because that's something people have talked about again and again and again, And
I think, for me, that was one of the challenges. We were told by WWF that it's not possible for tourism operators to deal with the forest department. They're the enemy. The tourism operators are the enemy of the forest department. There's no cooperation between the two at all. And we were told by various other NGOs and organizations working in India that it would be extremely difficult. And our first head naturalist was a chap called Sarat Champati.
Yes.
And Sarat had a very strong relationship with Dr. Pabla at MP Forest Department and invited Dr. Pabla to speak to our first cadre of guides that we were training in the andBeyond way, which was to be complementary to the conservation authorities rather than contradictory of the conservation authorities. So we were trying to show them that tourism could be a positive influence in these environments rather than a negative influence. And because of that interaction, Dr. Pabla heard that I had a background in wildlife translocation, and he invited me to review a document that had been circulating for translocating the Ga from Kana to Bandhavgarh. They had all the science on the numbers of animals and the species breakdown and the sex ratio. The only part they were missing was how to physically catch them in Kana and move them to Bandhavgarh. And that was just a chapter that said we will translocate them, full stop. And they didn't know how that was going to happen. So when I reviewed the document, I said, everything's here, it's done, let's do it. And he said, no, that chapter that says translocate, how does that work? So we engaged because of my background in translocation. He was completely open to us suggesting that we build the capacity within the forest department to do this. So he said, so you're not telling me you want to come and do it for us? I said, no, well, that's useless, because then when I go, you're not going to do it again. So I wanted to keep going when we're gone. So what we'll do is we'll train your vets, your forest directors, and when they've got the confidence to keep doing it, hopefully it will be sustainable. So he said, well, under those conditions, I'm prepared to engage with you. Let's see how we can make this thing work. So it was a wonderful, fortuitous opportunity that Sarat had the relationship with Dr. Pabla. He was very progressive. Of all the PCCFs that I've met, he was by far the most progressive from an engaging with the tourism industry perspective. And now I see in his books that he's absolutely aligned to the way we were thinking at the time. He was quite reserved about sharing that initially in the true Indian way, but was remarkable how that relationship developed with all the forest department staff that we engaged with, the forest vets and the forest directors. From sitting outside the forest director's office for 3.5 hours to get my first interview with a field director, to having the field director send a vehicle to fetch me at the airport when I came to India for my last visit. That was how the relationship warmed over time. And for me, that was remarkable. I would phone them and say, what's happening, what's going on? And they would share with me, because they knew that I was in this with them to try and help it better for their park. And as soon as we were all on the same page, that what's right for the park is right for all of us, then it was the hurdles were crossed and all those boundaries were easily broken down.
Okay, so I have something that I'm going to send you by email to say thank you for doing this, and it'll be a little piece of the story that you've just been telling. I was doing my doctoral research in Bandhavgarh when the gaur extinction happened, and I have photographs of the last gaurs before they went extinct, and I'm going to send you those.
That's amazing.
To put it all together. So,
I'll put it in my presentation on the gaur introduction. I've got a whole presentation there. So
yes, so I can give you that, and that's from the 90s. So I'll share all of that with you. So it's a lovely circle, the circle of life. They say everything fits somewhere. And
that's amazing. And Latika, I got a spreadsheet from the forest department from the 1990s with the population numbers every year. And that must have been a spreadsheet that you would have had input into.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
It was a simple Excel spreadsheet saying in this year this number, in that year that number, and then gone.
So have you got a copy of my thesis, Les? Have you seen my?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so I'm going to send you that as well, because this will all be, historical value now 20 years ago. But it's very interesting to see, because I also studied the entire landscape between Kanha and Bandhavgarh to study forest fragmentation patterns, identify all of the little patches in the middle where tiger presence was noted. All of that information, I'll send it all to you, to share. So that
would be wonderful.
Yeah, amazing. So tell me, Les, just to understand, you talked about, people like Great Plains with whom you are working on for projects like Rhinos Without Borders. How did this happen? How did you form a coalition of like-minded people who were working in tourism and conservation and come together to do this extraordinary, I don't know, what do you call it? Venture.
Venture, yeah. Well, I think it goes to as project manager, we'd translocated 6 rhino into Botswana. And when we released those 6 rhino, the president of Botswana himself came to the release. And we said, no, this is unbelievable. We have to take this to scale. If we've got that kind of political support, we need to take it to complete scale. And at the same time, as we had done that, Derek Joubert from Great Plains Conservation had also decided that spooling up the good work that Wilderness Safaris had done in reintroducing the first rhinos to Botswana, their rhinos were breeding very well, and he wanted to increase on their activities as well. So I spoke to our CEO and said, listen, I know Derek's trying to do a big reintroduction. We're going to do it. why are we doing this in opposition to each other? Why don't we combine? So I spoke to Derek, and he said he has no problem with that. Our CEO had no problem. We linked them together, and Rhinos Without Borders became a partnership between competing tourism operators. We never stopped competing for guests, but that's the commercial side. But we work together completely on conservation. And I think that for me has been a complete revelation. Because of that success, the Lionscape Coalition was born, which is wilderness safaris, Great Plains conservation, Singita, andBeyond, all working together for lion conservation. And I mean, that's where we need to be. Can you imagine all the tourism operators in India working together under one banner for a conservation outcome? That's going to be an unbelievable
That would be
feature.
Incredible. Yes, I mean, absolutely unreal. We were talking about this, and we were wondering whether self-regulation would be something that people would see. Another idea we've been exploring, and I would love to hear your views on this, is how to control unplanned development around the parks in India, because this is a huge issue.
It's the biggest problem.
It's our biggest issue, and somehow our planning, development planning, has just not managed to keep up with what is happening. So one of the things that we were looking at is this whole system of a carrying capacity and then basing tourism numbers on that carrying capacity. And what they've done right now is they painted pretty much every park with the same paintbrush. So they're doing exactly opposite of what you talked about, which is that you need to look at every situation individually and come up with a local solution rather than a blanket solution, which can often end up in a total mess. And once we look at every park as an individual one, and we come up with a carrying capacity for tourism vehicles, you then use that to go backwards to regulate how many institutions or tourism lodges can operate outside the park. What are your views on this? How do you think we can solve this problem? I mean, what would you recommend?
We gave it a lot of thought when we were there, and working with Ridgela, who was our Taj Safaris partner, and in fact with Sarat in the early days. And for me, unplanned, unregulated tourism is the death of conservation, and planned and regulated tourism is the birth of conservation. So two completely different outcomes from the same activity, and the key is in the plan. So understanding how you can use the plan to regulate that means that you have to understand where the power sits to approve the plan. And what we discovered is that the planning at penchant level, at local level, they normally understood, but the plan was imposed on them. So they weren't the people who approved the plan. So if you can get the plan to be approved locally, they can understand the local issues. You then take it up to the next level, and then you get the region, and then you finally get the state to approve it. So, but that's not the way it works in India. So it works top down. And if somebody knows somebody at the top, they get in, they get something, and they end up getting a development. And you have this incremental increase of unplanned, unsustainable, and potentially hugely harmful tourism. So it's not an easy one to fix. My view is that the carrying capacity system, which you've just described, which is based on observations of the ecological impact rather than on a formula, which doesn't apply. Formulas don't take into account the thing that we sell is an experience, and that has aesthetics. How do you measure aesthetics in a formula? So for me, it's trying to understand how you establish the carrying capacity, and then making sure that the center understands, or the state understands, you cannot approve an accommodation facility if it doesn't have access to the park written by the field director. So the field director then has to sign off that you have 2 vehicle access, otherwise you can't build those beds. If you have no vehicle access, you can't build the beds. Finished. And so you put the power with the field director because he understands what the carrying capacity of his reserve is. And if it's already overdone, well then it's very difficult to approve new beds. And if the state just keep approving new beds regardless, all you're doing is creating a massive negative against the tourism industry and against wildlife tourism specifically, which you don't want, and you want it to be important for them. So it has exactly the wrong outcome from a state perspective. It might give them short-term revenue, but long-term it's killing the conservation area. So for me, I think that the only solution in the Indian context is to add a line on any approval, which is that you have to have access to the park, signed by the field director and his ecologist. Otherwise, you can't build the bed. And I think that I don't think you're going to be able to get it right in the short term. I haven't been back for quite a few years, but I don't think it's changed that much.
No, it hasn't.
I spoke to, in those days, we had Asim Shivastav was the field director of Bandhavgarh. Mm-hmm. And I hosted Asim here in South Africa, and we spent many hours sitting around the fire discussing that challenge. And he said he would be happy to take on the responsibility of regulating his own tourism, but he would need bodyguards and a suit of armor because people would try and kill him because he was excluding them.
Yes. So
Latika, we got very innovative, and we decided to train local guides, and you weren't allowed to go into the park unless you had a trained local guide. Mm-hmm. And we gave andBeyond training to some of the local guides so that they could elevate themselves. And you know what the consequence was?
They opened a lot.
You would think you would have much better environmental impact of the guests going in because the guides had been trained. Exactly the opposite was true. The trained guides were not picked up by the industry because they cost extra money. And because the tourism in India is so sensitive, the trained guides had no jobs, missed out, so nobody wanted training the next year because it compromised their ability to earn a living. Yes. So we had a completely unintended consequence for a very well-meaning input. So yeah, India is not an easy place to operate.
No, it's yes. I can second that. Well, thank you, Les. I mean, I could chat with for another hour without thinking, but this has been wonderful. We've learned so much, and I think everybody is going to really want to learn more, and maybe we'll send some more people up your way, you know.
I'm sure that our Delhi office will be sending many to you. As you know, Sohail's still running the office there.
Yes, absolutely. Well, lovely to chat. I'll send you all of my thesis and the Gaur pictures to you on email.
Thanks very much, Latika. And when will this be aired?
This should be aired in July, but the whole series, we'll send you the whole link. We'd be very happy for andBeyond to also, spread the word about the series and claim it and put it out there saying this is another, one more measure where you've worked with everybody else across the world and we're talking big cat conservation. So I'll send you the whole everything and all the links soon.
Super. Thanks very much, Latika. It's been a real honor.
You too. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
If you were to look at the history, the first protected areas in the world were established in India by King Ashoka, a Buddhist king.